And I vividly remember this moment of the doctor turning to me and telling me that his heart was no longer beating. And I think in that moment, my life just changed in an instant.
Hello, everybody. I'm Cindy Holmes, the director of the School of Intuition and Healing, and we continue with our energy healing conversations today. And the series is Spiritual Awakening Stories. And today we are going to be talking to Tamrin. I'd like to welcome Tamrin on the podcast. We've known each other for some time. We met in Cape Town. We now both live in the UK. And Tamrin, why don't you introduce yourself to the audience? You'll do a much better job than I will.
Sure, Cindy. Thank you so much. I'm Tamrin. And as Cindy said, I am originally from sunny South Africa. And now I find myself nestled very inland in the UK. And I stay in a little town called Dunstable, where I have a private practice, which I opened about 2.5 years ago. I also teach yoga at a local yoga studio, and I facilitate women's circles, I host workshops, and I really just love what I get to do. I love the work that I do. I love the people that I work with. And of course, I mentor and tutor on the healing course as well, which is such a blessing and a privilege to be a part of the London team.
Wonderful. Thank you. And we love you being part of the London team. Um, We're going to talk a little bit about stories, and the theme is, where you were at, what happened, and kind of where you are now. Although yours runs into a little bit more complexity because we're not going to start at the beginning of your journey. We're going to talk about where you were just about to step into being a healer, and we're going to explore with sensitivity the complexity of your grief and the challenges that embodied you in terms of who you were at, and how your spirituality supported you at the time, or did it support you at the time. So I'd really like to jump in there really into kind of the expansion of your journey and where you were at, and then we can kind of delve into the more challenging side of your journey, Tamara.
Yeah, I speaking of this phrase, spiritual awakening, which has taken on, I think, different meanings for me through my spiritual journey. I came into the healing course, quote unquote, having had my spiritual awakening. I'd sort of had this very significant spiritual experience a few years prior to the healing course. And I'd been on sort of a foundational journey and found myself in the healing course where um, the work really deepened and I felt really aligned and I felt like I was stepping onto the path of my calling to do this work, to bring this work to others, and to really stand in my empowerment of becoming a healer. So, as I was heading towards the end of the course, I was pregnant. I'd sort of started life with my little family. I was very happily married. I had a daughter who was 2 at the time, and we had made this very big decision that we were going to immigrate to England. And I don't think at that time I really understood what that meant or what that even looked like. But, the prospects of it nonetheless was exciting. And, I had this very romanticized idea of moving to England, having my baby, being at home with him, taking my time to establish my practice as a healer, and just this really idealistic view of what this life in England would look like for us. And, coming to the end of my healing course, everything felt so aligned. Everything, I felt so in flow. And look, with anyone who's ever moved even house, even if you've moved house down the street, there's a lot of complications and effort and energy required. So, I was heavily pregnant with a toddler, and, so that was happening. But by and large, I just had this overwhelming sense of peace, and that, things were going to work out and things were going to be okay. When, and it was just before, Cindy, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was just before our accreditation when I went in to have a scheduled C section. And because I was diabetic through my pregnancy at that time. So I went in sort of ready to meet my little boy. And it was in that moment we were told that, they sort of do the checks, and they go through checking that Bubba's okay, that he's ready. And I vividly remember this moment of the doctor turning to me and telling me that his heart was no longer beating. And I think in that moment, my life just changed in an instant. And, what followed from there was really, I think, one of the most difficult months and periods of not only my life, but my family's life. You know, I sort of sit 3 years on from this now. So I have a little bit more spaciousness from it. I have a little bit more distance, so I do sort of come with a lot of mindfulness around anyone who is going through this journey right now of any kind of loss, of any kind of grief, to know that where I'm sitting at my journey, there's been a lot of processing and healing, and the healing still continues. But it really was the weeks and months following that where a sort of reawakening occurred, a recalibration of my spiritual self happened. And I not only had loss in terms of our baby, but also at that time we were scheduled to leave our country. So not only, which in and of itself is a whole grief process, even if you are excited about the prospects of immigration, that in and of itself is a process of you know saying goodbye to your loved one, saying goodbye to your very roots. So I was sort of in this grief around losing our son. I was in this grief around, now I had to leave my country, my support system that I've known for most of my life. And at the same time, I was sitting with the diabetic specialist who came back with my results and said, originally we thought this was diabetes that was contained to your pregnancy. In actual fact, you have been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, which is an autoimmune disease, which they currently have no cure for. We can manage it through insulin, but we currently have no cure for it. So all of these things, my health, my family, my home that I'd been so certain and aligned with, came crashing before my eyes. And that sense of feeling so stable and so at peace had all of a sudden, I almost call it like ripping the roots. My roots had been ripped from the soil. And it was this moment of reckoning of who am I now amidst all of this? And how do I see the world now? I was so certain about how I was seeing the world and what my spiritual awakening prior had led me to. And now it was a question of, how do I see the world now? How is my perspective and life changed now?
And Tamrin, can I just ask, at the time, which must have been extremely difficult, did you kind of lose faith completely? I think in my situation, I think I really would have questioned my belief system in terms of, if I think of how I have a relationship with the universe, I think I would have broken that relationship too, and just not have faith in all these structures and beliefs that were in place in order to get the expanded life that you had, this exciting young family, pioneering off to, living the dream really, to that moment in time. And I'm always curious, and I always ask the question, because you have a belief system and you manifest within that belief system, and in that agenda, that alignment, that expansion, and something happens. Did you question, and for how long? And then what led you back? Or did you just step into a spiritual process straight away?
I would love to say I just stepped into a spiritual process straight away.
I have to say, I would have called you out on it, but I'm glad you didn't.
Yeah, I, what I will say, and what I'm sort of, it's interesting because I'm sort of sitting now having integrated a lot of that experience. But when I sort of travel back to that time, it felt, so there's a few things at play. I mean, emotionally and physically, I was going through PTSD. So I was going through post traumatic stress. So for me to have a really, and I think this is really important for people to know, when you're going through a trauma or processing a trauma, it's really hard to be stable. It's very difficult to, because you're seeing the world with such a different lens. So, you know, I really went from this very stable, grounded place to a very unstable place. And that was very confronting for me, because all of a sudden, there was a questioning of, I've done all this work, I've done all this internal work, I had this beautiful spiritual awakening. What does this all mean? I think I was just left with a lot of questions and, honestly, anger. I was angry. I was angry that I was dealt this lot. And and what was really interesting to me is I was angry at a lot of people. I was
I
angry that
remember that.
I was angry that I had to carry this burden. And it became very much about, I had to carry this burden. I had to carry this emotion. Why can't other people understand or feel what I'm feeling? It was really interesting in a sense that I I wanted people to understand my grief, because I felt in so much pain around it. I felt really a physical pain in my grief. And I was angry that other people couldn't meet me there. And I was angry at spirit, right? And I remember one of my favorite moments we always had, I favorite, I use that word for lack of a better phrase, but one of the moments we had, Cindy, is when you saw me in that sort of just after a couple, I think it was so fresh, a few weeks after that. And you said to me, you have the right to be angry, right? You have the right to push back to spirit. I call it spirit, divine consciousness, God, whatever label I refer to as spirit. But for me, that felt like a sense of relief. What I will say, what is different, as opposed to, because I had been through um, mental health disorders before. I'd been through depression. I'd been through panic attacks and breakdowns years prior to this, before my spiritual awakening. I think what was different about the flavor of this experience, or different about how I experienced this going through this sort of trauma and dealing with the acceptance of having an autoimmune disease and immigration, is that I had an awareness now that I couldn't hide from. I knew that I needed help, that I was in a really dark place, and I knew that there was no way I was going to get myself out of this alone, and that I knew that I needed real comprehensive help in terms of, I call it like the trenches of life. This is like the pit, right? In the depths and in the pit. Because I remember wanting to end my life and not wanting to, I thought, well, if there is this other spiritual side and I'm just going to come back, then that's okay. If I believe that Gavino is on the other side, then that's going to be fine. But I knew that I had this awareness that I was here for a reason and a purpose, that I was with my family for a reason and a purpose, and I couldn't ignore that side of myself. So I knew I had to reach out for help, and that I had to get help in a really supportive way in order just to help me out of that pit of darkness. So there was a difference there, that I had this awareness, and that I knew that there was this divinity that I had touched before in my prior spiritual awakening, and that I knew that even though it felt distant, even though I didn't feel connected to it right now, I couldn't deny that it was still there. And so I began this, let's use the word process, this journey of coming back to that remembering, slowly by slowly by slowly. And it certainly wasn't linear. It was incredibly messy. And it was very messy, Cindy knows. And I realized, now sitting on the other side of it, I think the gift, the alchemy of that experience was really, I always say, people know that they die, but they don't know death. And I feel like I really faced death in the sense of coming to understand it in a very deep, intrinsic way. And that in and of itself was a whole reawakening of coming to realize my mortality. Actually, no one is guaranteed another day in this life. So it was almost this evolution to my spiritual awakening. My first spiritual awakening was really, it's like the scales had dropped. It was really expansive. I'd been sort of exposed to this world that I sort of knew was there, but now it was really real and tangible. And then this experience of this loss with Gavino and the journey, and this took months, right? Year, 2 years, of really walking with this and allowing it to unfold in the way that it needed to. Now it became a deeper understanding of my spiritual self in this physical expression, that this being alive is truly a privilege, right? And that when you come to know death in that incredibly real way, not just like, oh, I know one day we're going to die, but a real embodiment of, oh, none of us are getting out of this experience alive. There's a humility and reckoning that happens with that experience, where spirituality no longer becomes a thing of doing or a pomp and a ceremony, although I love pomp and ceremony as much as the next person. And I love all my embellishments and, but you really start to realize that the quality of true spirituality is is not contained in those things, and that every day, and I think you said this sort of in our pre-discussion, that every day is this opportunity of this awakening, of this connecting to the divine, of what I call exploring the great mystery, right? And that was the remembering that was unfolding for me. And some days I forget that. Some days I'm further away from that, but it is that constant coming back to that remembering of that divinity within that expresses without.
Yeah. And I'm sure that there's, as you say, there are good days and bad days, like we were talking about before. And kind of, I remember us at that time having conversations around other people, and how they came, interestingly, spiritual people coming, and offering advice. And really, because this is a spiritual podcast, when people, and I'm going to ask this question because I know people spoke about this. How did you feel when people tried to bring the bigger picture in the early days, when you were still very raw, and said, well, there's meaning in this, and there's a reason for this, and everything happens for a reason? How do you think that feels? And I think it's so important because for me, I think it's a really important part of this conversation.
Absolutely. I think, and again, I want to like reiterate, I have some space from this now, and there's some integration that has taken place. So I can sort of speak from this coming out of the tunnel, the other side of the tunnel, so to speak. In that moment, suspended in my grief, and I think of Sadhguru, who's a wonderful spiritual teacher who I follow, who says that when someone's going through grief, you treat them like a little child. You treat them like they need so much love and care, because it's so true that you are so tender and so I want to use the I wanted to use the word broken, but I don't think that's fair. You're so hurt in that moment, and you're so suspended in your hurt that to see the bigger picture doesn't help take away the hurt, right? Or to be told, oh, there's the silver lining, doesn't make you look up and see the silver lining. And I think this is the beauty of the work that we do, and I particularly see in my practice. There is just this moment of pause when someone is in that space, this moment of actually saying, this is okay, and you have the right to feel that way. And so much of my journey was actually accepting that for myself. So I had people, and it wasn't many, but I had people try and speak into my life. And I had it recently, actually. I lost my dog from bone cancer in the beginning of this year, and it was incredibly difficult and challenging. And I remember sharing about it. We were sort of sitting in a circle with a few healers, and we hadn't made the decision yet to say goodbye to him, but I was still quite working through it and holding it, and still felt really tender about it. And I shared it, and someone said to me, "Oh, but there's a deeper meaning," and started to started to do the whole, is it spiritual bypassing? Probably, but do the whole, you you got to be okay with this. And I understand people's natural tendency to want to do that because it's comfortable for us. It's comfortable when other people are okay and comfortable. But I remember sort of thinking to myself, I'm not ready to hear that. I know that what they are saying has value, but I'm not ready to hear that yet. And I feel comfortable where I am with, in feeling pretty sucky about this right now. And I think for me, so much of my journey with the loss of Gavino, with my autoimmune disease, with moving to England, was less about showing everyone, okay, I've got this, I've got this, I've got this all together, because there was a period I was doing that. Almost like I had to almost prove to myself, that I'm not the victim, I'm not failing. Where in actual fact, I had to come to this place to say, I'm allowed to feel this way. Some really hard things have happened to me, and it is okay for me to have sadness, grief, anger, pain, and hurt around this. And when I did that, when I allowed myself that spaciousness to feel that, I actually felt so much more relief, and I felt so much more softness around it all. And I didn't feel like I had to prove anymore. And it felt like it took a weight off my shoulders. And I didn't feel like I had to get to this outcome, or even get to where I am now, whatever that might mean. There was It was still uncomfortable. It was still really painful, but I remember talking to myself and sort of saying, this is okay. I had to really kind of coach myself into that space of acceptance with it. And I think when I did that, it sort of gave it some room to breathe, instead of feeling this need to contain it into an insight, or contain it into what's the positive thing here, what's the message, what's the lesson. And I think we live in a society right now where we look at Instagram, we look at Facebook, and we seem to think these things, because of carousels and slides and little short videos, we think that these things are contained really neatly in a perfect little image and a perfect little bubble. But this is not life, right? And we know this as human beings, that life is messy, and it requires a lot from us, and we're not always going to have this perfect little insight that's captured in four little images. And I think it's okay when we allow ourselves to move through, to use your terminology, Cindy, expansion and contraction, right? And that's going to look different for everyone as well.
So what I'm hearing, and there was a huge amount of surrender that took place, like, and then there was trust with yourself. And in my words or terminology, when you learn to be a witness for yourself, that compassionate witness for yourself, rather than trying to fix it or prove it, or and just be with it, from the sounds of things. And there were lots of lumps and bumps on the way, with the pushing and the pulling, and then eventually holding that pain and grief, and trusting yourself to hold that, um, is what really sounds like the process of that. And with moving with that, and I think that must continue today. They're still moving with that grief and pain, and I think we all suffer grief and pain that we move with, and that maybe doesn't necessarily, we never find out the reason or the silver lining, or and I think one needs to hold that. But what were the key sort of, there must have been some key things along the way that formed a practice, or so for example, I know running was one that really supported you, in terms of, we can talk about meditation and whatever, but running is huge. Talk about the healing of, because I know that was one of the kind of things that you, and still today, when things are a little bit, it's like, if I haven't done my running today, I'm not. So just talk about those key pillars that really
I think
supported you.
I think running really speaks into the need for presence, and one of the ways I knew I could really switch off my mind and the rumination was through running, right? Because I knew that when I put my headphones in, and I often didn't even play anything through my headphones, is all I had to worry about was moving my body in space. I had no one else to look after. I had no one to care for. I, it was running's not a complicated thing for me. I know I just got to pick up my legs and run forward. And it was just really being present and not expecting again an outcome, not sort of looking for that answer. So running for me became this way to be really present with my body, with my breath. And if integration and insights came, that was great. But also just to be present for me in nature. So I'm very blessed that I'm like 500 meters away from a beautiful woodlands. And this became my solitude, my place of I remember I'd be on my run and then I would stop halfway through and just cry and sort of cry to the trees and talk to the trees. And, people might find that really woo woo, but it's fine. I think for me, I really found this connection through movement and nature. And, even before my running, Cindy, I actually joined just to show people that, spirituality and the spiritual process can present itself in so many ways. I joined a mixed martial arts um, um, club right here, and something in me, and this is such a good point to make. When you get that intuitive hit, when something stands out to you, like answer it, trust it. And this is when I was sort of coming back to those intuitive hits again around, oh, okay, I saw this, it was right there down the road from me. I felt drawn to it. And I remember going into this club, and it was just full of like men, full of like big, you know, kind of men who are not there to talk about emotions. There's no sort of connection. They're there to punch bags and kick each other. But let me tell you what the value there was in that. To go back to your previous question, Cindy, is I didn't have to be anything to those men other than show up and work hard in the session. They couldn't care about who I was, what my history was, how I felt that day. It was very masculine in the sense that I could just rock up, do what needed to be done in the session, and leave again. And I think that's such a great example that kind of leads to your previous question around what about when spiritual people ask you that, or, no one asked me questions. no one no one wanted, and it wasn't because they weren't interested. They were there to come and work out, and that's what they were there to do, and that's what I did as well. And that for me was incredibly healing, to just come, be present, get some anger and frustration out without a story, without needing a narrative, and just to allow that to move through me. So for me, movement was a big part of my healing. My yoga, my mixed martial arts training, and my running. I also think that, going back to basics in my healing practice was really vital. So my grounding, breath work was incredibly important for me, and nothing fancy, just sometimes going to my room, sitting with my hands on my chest, and just focusing on my breath. So, again, coming back to that presence, coming back to that holding of we're here now, we're here now. And this is, I think when you're going through a big trauma like that, I call it like eating the elephant one bite at a time, right? What can I do with what I have right now? And finally, I found journaling incredibly helpful at that time. Not having prompts, not having specific reflections, but just when my mind felt busy, just allowing a flow of consciousness to sort of permeate on the pages of my journal. And then going back and reading some reflections, reading some of the journey, and seeing already how far I've come with the journey, maybe where I've taken some steps back, because that happens as well. Sometimes we run forward, sometimes we're hurdling, and then sometimes we need to take a few steps back in order to keep the forward momentum. So those were really grounding practices. If I'm thinking about saying all those pillars, it's really grounding practices, really being present in the body, being in the here and now. And then for me personally, what I also really loved is ritual. So creating ceremony, creating ritual, because that felt like really deep sacred self-care and a way for me to connect with my spirituality again. And I felt like I needed those levels of support externally to bring me back into that.
So after a period of time, the spiritual practices started coming back, and finding that alignment to that energy again. Um, and I think that's important, that there are times we separate and come back. And I think as human beings, I mean, we can know and know and know, but there are times when things make us doubt, and I think doubt, the doubt is the shadow of inquiry, and sometimes we do go into the shadow of inquiry, which is doubt. And so when it's about finding that curiosity again, and finding that, and the curiosity of different ways, and it's not just one thing, it's the physical, it's the emotional, it's the mental, it's the spiritual, that supports people through grief, um, and healing. So we could go on talking about this for another half an hour with more questions, but I feel like we've kind of talked about grief and the complexity that grief can bring. And I think the importance of not spiritually bypassing it. We've heard around, because that land that didn't go well for you, um, in terms of a process of pushing through, created a contraction, and then eventually there's the just the surrender, the acceptance, and then some form of softening for yourself, and I'm sure for your family too. The one question that I'm going to ask and lean into, if somebody has had loss. So really our question is if people are beginning at the beginning of curiosity be about healing and consciousness, people are looking for something around healing and consciousness, and maybe even those who are dealing with deep grief right now, and they don't know where to start. What would your advice be to them? What would you say?
I think the first thing I would say, that grief is a very personal journey. And it's not these neat stages. It is, I call it the grief waves. And sometimes we're in the ocean and we're floating and we're in that surrender, and sometimes we get really dunked under by a wave. If you're in that place of being in the storm of the ocean and you don't know where you are and you're feeling lost, my best advice would be present, you know and that could literally look like going for a walk, you know focusing on your breath. So how am I feeling right here, right now? And if it is sadness, be okay with that. Give yourself compassion to hold that. you know a book I would absolutely suggest is You Are Not Alone, a fantastic book around grief. And one of the things that she really spoke to there is in how, in the West in particular, we are quite pragmatic about grief. You have a funeral, you can grieve this person here, and it's a week and then everyone sort of moves on with their lives, which is natural. This is, because people have lives and life continues, but you might still be sitting with that pain, with that hurt, with that loss, and to know that that's okay. To know that, particularly something like grief, when you have lost someone you love, is probably something you are going to walk with for the rest of your life, and that there are layers to it, and that all we can do is take one layer off at a time, take one moment at a time with it, and to know that you don't have to have the answers, you don't have to have it figured out, and that you are worthy of feeling the full spectrum of the emotions around your grief, or even a loss, such as a job, uh, moving homes, your health, that it is okay to have a very natural human response to the emotions of disappointment, sadness that might come from that. And I think it's that acknowledgement to know that I'm worthy of still being here, that I'm worthy of still having a good life, that I'm worthy of having this experience from a held, compassionate place that can connect you to something within, right? To know that that worthiness doesn't come from a place of achievements and outcomes and accolades, and it's not attached to anything, that comes from that space within. And that's that curiosity you can hold. What does that within look like to me? And that can be expressed in so many ways in spirituality. There are so many teachings that one can look into, but to really know that it starts from within, and to start that inquiry, that curiosity from within.
That makes a lot of sense, and I think that is important. Can you just, who is the author of the book? Just remind us of the book's name and the author.
I actually have the book here, Cindy. I'm going to grab
Okay,
it for
don't
you
worry,
quickly.
we'll get it and put it in the podcast. Okay,
So
I'm just
it's
gonna, yeah.
You Are Not Alone by Carried Lloyd. She's a British author, and I believe she has a podcast as well. And it was really helpful on my journey, because she really looks at grief from this holistic perspective, psychologically, anecdotally, and it's a really beautiful book and resource to refer to.
Well, thank you for sharing that with us and for sharing this incredibly challenging journey with spiritual principles, moving away, coming back to them. And really, being grounded and present is really what I'm hearing, being grounded and present and feeling, and not spiritually bypassing or pushing away or actioning grief. Um, Outside of spaciousness, outside of contemplation, outside of those things. So, Tamrin, thank you for being here today, being so honest and so vulnerable to share this with our audience. We are very, very grateful to have you. So, thank you very much.
It's a absolute pleasure. And yeah, I hope that this story connects with someone in a really deep way, to know that if they are on a grief journey, that it is okay. Again, to know that I've had some space from this and I've had some time. So to honor where they are in their process, and to remind people, yes, to be present might feel really simple and unsatisfactory, but I think in those moments of real pain and hurt, simplicity is actually the magic, is actually the place where we can really hold ourselves. So thank you so much, Cindy, for this opportunity. It's always a privilege and an honor to share my story, and hope that it may help empower and inspire someone else.
Tamrin, thank you so much. Thank you for listening, everybody. Please, can I ask you, if you enjoyed this, to like it, to share it, and also to follow us on whichever medium you are using to listen to this. And I look forward to sharing more stories with you in the weeks to come. Thank you all. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye bye.